Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our March 15th session of the EU and US climate change mitigation. We are into our third week of instruction, and today we are hosting a very special guest. I am going to introduce her right now. First, repeat that we are a very international group ourselves. We are students from Austria, from the United States, from Spain, France, the Netherlands, Turkey, Ecuador, and Japan. Did I forget a country? I don't think so. All right. And our guest today, I think, may be coming to us from Norway. And you can see on our screen here, Dr. Christina Voigt is a professor of law at the University of Oslo in Norway. She is an internationally renowned expert in international environmental law and teaches, speaks, and publishes widely on legal issues of climate change, environmental multilateralism, and sustainability. For the last decade, she worked as principal legal advisor for the government of Norway in the UN climate negotiations and negotiated the Paris Agreement and its rule book, something we are trying to learn about right now. Professor Voigt is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, yet another acronym we are learning, PAICC. She is also a mother of two young boys, Victor and Oscar. All right, I am going to stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. Voigt and invite her to share her screen and to speak to us for the next half an hour or so, after which we will take a short break and then return for a discussion. Dr. Voigt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Thank you so much for your kind introduction, but first and foremost, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege, always a privilege to be able to speak to such an interesting international group of interested young students. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I could be there in person, but I am indeed speaking to you today from Oslo in Norway, where I'm living. Now, as I was just introduced, I work on many different aspects of climate change, from domestic climate litigation, domestic legislation, all the way up to the international level. And I've been doing this for the last almost 20 years. So I could speak and maybe in the discussions also address a large range of topics. If you have questions about anything, I'm happy to discuss anything about climate change, especially the international negotiations. But in my presentation today, I was asked to focus on a particular element of the Paris Agreement's architecture, and that is the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. And I'm particularly glad about having this opportunity because maybe you've never heard about this committee. And so I have the feeling have many other people because it's something that is established in the Paris Agreement, but it hasn't come yet entirely into operation. And I would like to explain to you what it is, what its roles and functions are under the overall architecture of the Paris Agreement and where we currently are. And as was just mentioned, I am indeed the co-chair of the committee, together with my colleague Hasib Gohar from Pakistan. And we've just had a meeting of the committee last week in Bonn, and we were both re-elected as co-chairs for another 3 years. So let me see if I can share my screen. That works. And this is my presentation somewhere here. It starts from the beginning. Just briefly, can you confirm that you can see? It's all green now, that you can see my screen?
We see your screen very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, So as I already mentioned, the committee itself is included in the Paris Agreement in Article 15. And I assume that you taking this course are by now experts on the Paris Agreement. It requires a little bit of background knowledge on the agreement, but I'd say I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have after the talk. Now, it was not a given that the Paris Agreement should contain an element of compliance. As you perhaps know, the Durban Mandate, upon which the agreement was negotiated and finally established, doesn't mention anything on compliance. And when I had the privilege to negotiate the agreement on behalf of Norway, and when we made the first intervention on the idea that maybe a compliance mechanism or committee may be worthwhile to consider to include in the agreement. That was in early 2014, a year before the agreement was established. It was met with a lot of opposition and resistance by many parties. Some parties feared that a compliance committee went beyond the mandate of what parties were asked to negotiate. Other parties, including the United States, by the way, feared that a compliance committee, its sheer existence would water out or water down other parts of the agreement, make parties less willing to commit to legally binding obligations. There was a fear around compliance, but by the end of the day, by the very end of the negotiations in Paris, it survived. And in Article 15, we now have the establishment of a mechanism to facilitate implementation of and promote compliance with the provisions of the Paris Agreement, and that mechanism consists of a committee. And of course, the entire idea behind having a compliance committee in the Paris Agreement is to enhance the agreement's effectiveness. You perhaps know that there are a couple of legally binding obligations that parties have that committed themselves to them. And by having a compliance committee, there's at least some possibility to engage with a party if a party does not comply with its legally binding obligations or has challenges with implementing them. But it is also meant to create or enhance mutual trust and confidence of the parties with each other by having this committee, which looks at whether parties actually do what they said they would do, or help parties to implement and comply effectively. Now, the committee is expert-based. It is not punitive in character. It's supposed to be facilitative, helping parties to be in compliance rather than punishing them for non-compliance. And that's a phenomenon we see in many different international treaties, in particular environmental treaties, that they have these in-house committees or mechanisms that are not there to put parties out and criticize them, but rather engage with them and find out what the challenges are and try to help them to get back into compliance. So it is not adversarial, it's not punitive, and it's supposed to function in a transparent manner. And it's also very important that it shall not imply sanctions, it shall not function as an enforcement or dispute mechanisms, and it shall respect the sovereignty of each party. That's, of course, a very basic requirement. Now, the committee, even though the committee was established in the agreement itself, which is, of course, in 2015 when it was adopted, it took until 2019, until the climate COP in Madrid, until the first members were elected. There's a reason for it, which I can explain, but it's not so important. But the first members of the committee were elected in 2019. And then we started meeting for the first time in 2020. So it's a very young composition of the committee. We are just about 2 years old. And as you perhaps can understand, we have never been able to meet in person because the first meeting was scheduled at about the same time the pandemic started. So for the last 2 years, all the meetings were online, and it was only last week when we, for the first time ever, met in person in Bonn, where the Secretariat is housed for the Paris Agreement. This is the composition of the agreement. So you see it has a fair and equitable geographic composition of 2 members each from the main 5 UN regional groups, and then 1 member from small island developing states sits, and 1 member from least developing countries. And those 12 members are accompanied by 12 alternates, so that 24 people in this committee. Now, they're not all lawyers, thanks God, that's a good thing. They're coming with different backgrounds. There are many lawyers, but they're also experts in transparency and adaptation and finance. They have legal, but also scientific, economic, and other backgrounds. And they serve all for a term of 3 years and can be renewed once. And the committee has 2 co-chairs, one from a developed country and one from a developing country. And that are, as I already mentioned, my colleague Hasib Gohar, a diplomat from Pakistan for the developing country side, and myself for the developed countries. This is the current composition. So you see all 24 members, and you see that they are coming really from all over the world. And it is an interesting, very interesting discussion that we're currently having within the committee on very central legal aspects of the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, one of the most interesting question is how can this committee actually become active, and what can it do? So take the first thing first, the first question: how can an issue get to the committee? It's an issue of implementation or compliance, individual implementation or compliance. And there are 3 modes of initiation, 3 modes of how a question of implementation or compliance can get to the committee. The first mode is by a party itself. I'll say a word about this in a second. The second mode is by the committee itself. And the third one is through the transparency system. I don't know if you've maybe talked about the enhanced transparency framework established in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, under which parties report biannually on how they implement and achieve their nationally determined contributions, their NDC. They also provide information on their national inventory report. And all this information is reviewed by technical expert review teams. And if these technical expert review teams find that there is something not quite consistent, that's something where the committee can come in. So just very briefly to that first mode of initiation. As I said, a party can always come to the committee if it faces challenges in its implementation or compliance with provisions of the Paris Agreement. Of course, it hasn't happened yet because we are very new, but personally, I think this is one of the main added values of the agreement, the agreement as well, but of the committee, that if a party, for example, is unable to submit its next NDC or to submit its national adaptation plan or its biannual transparency report, it could indeed come to the committee and say, we have capacity challenges, can be personal capacity, it can be legal capacity, it can be financial capacity. Please help us to address these challenges so that we actually are able to implement the Paris Agreement effectively. And then the committee would have to act, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm just showing you that this is one of the possible ways of how an issue could get to the committee by a party itself in with regard to its own implementation or compliance. We'll see if this happens, but I think there might be an interest by parties to do so. The second possibility is where the committee itself can become active, and that's the real core initiation. That is, these are the core legal obligations that parties have. And here in a decision within the rule book that was adopted in Katowice in 2018, Decision 20 CMA1, there is this one paragraph where there are 4 different scenarios under which the committee can become active on its own behalf. It doesn't have to ask the party first. And that is, for example, where a party has not submitted an NDC or communicated or maintained an NDC, or where the party has not communicated its biennial transparency report, or where a party has not participated in what's called the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, which is a requirement. Parties have to participate in this process, or for developed country parties where a party has not communicated information with regard to finance, in particular with regard to financial resources that developed country parties would provide to developing countries. It's called ex ante finance, where they say, this is what we're going to put on the table, not what that's what we have put on the table. So if a party has not done one of these things, the committee can become active. And the third element is what I already tried to explain to you. Under the enhanced transparency framework, there is the obligation of parties to biannually provide very detailed information on the implementation and achievement of their NDC, which you perhaps know the content of the NDC is not legally binding. The only thing about the NDC that is binding is to submit an NDC. But the other thing that is binding is that every party, every other year, has to submit information of how well it is doing in implementing its NDC. And if that information is not there or is inconsistent with the guidelines for reporting, then the committee can take up this issue. So the next question is, what can the committee actually do? And that is maybe the most important one, and maybe also the one that is most criticized. You have perhaps heard that the committee has been, or the mechanism under which the committee operates has been criticized as having no teeth, it's too weak, it cannot do anything. This is what you sometimes hear when in particular in relevant academic channels, the committee is being discussed. But I'm a little bit more optimistic and also a bit more careful with that kind of criticism, not just because I'm the co-chair, but because I think there is much more potential within that committee than what it is being given credit for. The committee, for example, will always be able to reach out to a party, engage in a dialogue with a party concerned, ask the party what's happening, why, for example, why don't you have an NDC? Why don't you provide the relevant information? And that, in general, is something that parties don't like. Already, this is something that is not well perceived. You may perhaps know that under the Kyoto Protocol, there was also a still is a compliance committee, which has a facilitative branch and an enforcement branch. And at some point, the compliance committee reached out to Canada. That's already many years ago, because Canada was considered to be not in compliance with its obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. And so that committee reached out to Canada, and this just one letter was, something what led eventually to Canada withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. So that was unfortunate, but it also shows that just, engaging with a party is a very sensitive issue, and it has to be, done with great care and diplomatic skill. So in order to actually engage with a party and not to cause the withdrawal by a party concerned. So the dialogue with the party is important. It's going to be always the first step for the committee to find out what actually happened. Why is there an issue of compliance? Committee will then also be able to identify together with the party these challenges and provide recommendations of how these issues can be addressed. Now, as you perhaps know or can think, in many cases, if a party to an international agreement does not comply with the agreement, that can be due to many different reasons. It can just be missing political willingness. Parties just say, no, we don't. we are not interested in complying. That happens. But in most cases, it is an issue of capacity constraint. In particular, when it comes to environmental agreements of global nature like this, where parties face capacity constraints in terms of, there's just no human capacity to provide a report, or they don't have the financial means, or you need particular technology to monitor, for example, emissions, which is quite a difficult issue when it comes, for example, to forest-based emissions. You basically need a satellite system to monitor what's happening in your forest area. So there are technologies involved as well in just simply complying with reporting obligations. So there can be technology constraints where parties may want to comply, but can because they're missing the relevant technological tools, or just simply finance. That is in many cases, of course, reason for non-compliance. And because of that, the committee can engage with relevant bodies and arrangements, both under the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and make help the party to engage with these support bodies. And if you think about who these bodies are, then you may understand that this is going to be a very interesting, but also very sensitive part of the committee's work. It could, for example, be the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the financial mechanisms under the serving the Paris Agreement. It could be the Adaptation Fund. It could be the technology body. There are many different arrangements under the Paris Agreement already that would help or are supposed to support parties in their performance under the agreement. And here the committee can help to build that bridge between the party concerned and those relevant bodies. And it can make recommendations to the party concerned on how to engage with these support bodies and make these recommendations known to the relevant bodies. So that's an interesting aspect of the committee. This was very, very important to developing country parties, that this would be a measure that the committee can take in order for developing countries to agree that a compliance committee was included in the Paris Agreement. So these were very difficult negotiations that we had on the run-up to Paris in 2015, and they were resolved by this kind of possibility for the committee to engage with support arrangements. Further, the committee can recommend or work together with the party concerned on a compliance action plan, or just called an implementation action plan, where the party concerned, once the challenges are identified, is for itself making a plan and saying, this is what we're going to do within the next year or 2 years to get back into compliance. This is what we need. These are the actions that we're going to take. And the committee will follow up and see and check and discuss with the party concerned whether this is actually happening. So that's just meant to have a more structured approach to getting parties back into compliance. And finally, and that's maybe the most kind of punitive tool or punitive measure that the committee can adopt, the committee can, at the end of the day, can issue a public finding of fact. What exactly that is, we still have to see, but basically the committee can say party X is not in compliance due to this and this situation. And this is something that states definitely don't like. The reputational scratch, the reputational challenge by a public statement of an independent body, independent committee is something that no state likes, and it's of course hope that before we get to that situation where the committee would make a public findings or statement on findings of fact, that parties would actually rather go back to complying with the agreement rather than being called upon or called out in public. Another aspect of the committee, and actually I would be terribly interested in hearing maybe some of your thoughts on this, is that the committee can also address what is called systemic issues. Everything that I've mentioned so far only concerns the individual performance of parties, where one party has, for example, not submitted its biannual transparency report. But the committee can also take up issues that apply to a certain number of parties, where it sees that this is happening again and again and again. So it's not an issue of individual non-performance, but it's something that is more inherent and systemic to the agreement's architecture and its rules themselves. And it can raise this issue of systemic challenges to the attention of the governing body of the PAICC agreement, which is called the CMA, the convention, the conference of the parties serving as the meeting of the parties under the PAICC agreement, CMA. So it's the equivalent to the COP. The COP is the governing body for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the CMA serves the Paris Agreement. So it can bring this issue to the attention of the CMA, and it can come up with its own recommendations of how to address systemic functions. And this is a very, very potentially powerful function of the committee. As I said, we are in very early stages of our work. But if, for example, parties do not comply with their collective obligations or do not submit reports on time, and it applies to many, it can actually be something where the committee can raise an issue of general importance and provide recommendations of how to address them. It can also be political, so we have to be careful not to overstep the mandate of the committee, but it is a double-edged sword, and something that may be interesting to watch over time, what the committee is going to make out of this possibility. Now, to talk about what we've done so far over those 2 years. As I said, the world attention hasn't really come yet to grasp that committee in its entirety, but I think it's going to change in the next year or two. But during the pandemic period, we had 4 informal meetings, everything online, which was really, really difficult because many of the members did not know each other before we were elected in Madrid. And then we had to meet online. And you really, in order to work as a committee, you need to trust each other, you need to know each other, you need to have those coffee breaks and maybe dinners where you can establish a common unity to work together. And that wasn't possible. But at the same time, the committee was tasked with a very concrete mandate. We had to develop our rules of procedure and then suggest them or propose them to the CMA in Glasgow, CMA 3. So actually for the last 2 years, we did a lot of online negotiations at very weird times, sometimes during the day, sometimes during the night. And you listen to me now online, and it's not the same as if I'd been there in person. But this is a lecture, but really trying to find compromise, trying to find a solution, negotiating text on the screen is incredibly difficult over Zoom or Teams or whatever we have. So that's been a real challenge. But we did kind of succeed. We had our first set of rules of procedure ready to be proposed to the CMA in Glasgow, and they were adopted and are now in place. That was important, but we didn't finalize this whole the entire procedural rules. So we now have to work on the remaining procedural rules, which turn out to be the much more challenging and difficult ones, but partly delivered on some part of our aspects of work. So this is what the committee agreed to on, for example, rules of the co-chairs, conflict of interest clauses, which is very important because, you can, for example, if you are involved in a domestic climate litigation issue, you shouldn't be on the committee, or at least not be on the committee if that particular party is raising an issue in the committee. There's also possibilities now for decision making and voting, even if the committee is not able to meet physically. This is actually quite an innovation in the overall international climate regime, which doesn't really have any rules on voting, let alone voting in a digital manner. So I hope we paved new grounds here, that you don't have to meet all the time in person, but can actually do some decisions in an online format. We have possibilities for observer participation. The meetings for the first 2 years were unfortunately closed to the public, but the meeting last week, was the first meeting that was open and observers could attend, although nobody did. So what is happening now? The next steps are that this year we have to finalize the rules of procedure for the committee. They are supposed to be sent to Egypt, to the CMA. Egypt is the presidency of the next COP, which takes place in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year, and the COP 27 happens then in conjunction with CMA 4 for the Paris Agreement, and CMA 4 is supposed to adopt, the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement is supposed to adopt the remaining rules of procedure. And I just last week had a chat with the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa. When I was in Bonn, she visited the committee because there's a real strong focus on what the committee does now, within the Secretariat at least. And she told me that the Egyptian presidency for this year's COP has this on their radar, and they consider the rules of procedure for the compliance committee a very important outcome and result and deliverable from this year's climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, working on the rules of procedure is not the only thing that the committee does. It is also slowly looking into the possibility to actually start its work on, addressing issues of parties' performance. It's not easy. It's a little early. We do have the need for the remaining procedural rules before we can actually start reaching out to a party. But the committee has started to look into information of how many parties have submitted their NDC, how many parties have submitted their finance communication. Are there any that haven't? Is that already something that the committee should put on its radar to be ready to reach out to parties once its rules and procedure, remaining rules of procedure are in place at the end of this year? So this is where we are right now. And as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I just have 2 or 3 minutes left, and I'm just happy to briefly talk about how this in general fits into the outcome from Glasgow. I don't know if you had a lecture on Glasgow, on what came out of Glasgow. Bruce?
We just started to talk about that last week on Thursday in the 4 areas that the British presidency established. We would like to hear very much what you have to say. We are especially interested in formalization of the Paris rulebook and also the financial agreement to begin in 2023 with $100 billion of support annually from the developed world.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, Glasgow was an interesting COP for many reasons, partly because there was no Conference of the Parties in 2020 due to the pandemic. So there was a buildup on issues that needed to be addressed, partly also because it was the first climate COP after the re-entry of the United States to the Paris Agreement. So everybody was, of course, waiting to see how the new administration would tackle this issue. The IPCC report did come, the first part, at least from the sixth assessment report, came in August last year. There were high expectations around that. We had an unprecedented summer last year in Europe, but also in Northern America, with climate impact so drastic that you could feel that it's, you know, getting closer to your home. But it was also something that was very important for the UK. It was their first international meeting, or the hosting an international meeting after Brexit. And of course, the UK also wanted to show the world that we can do that. And we are part of that multilateral family, and we are able to host a successive climate top meeting. So there was a lot of expectations. And at some point, the expectations were so sky high that I was there as a negotiator, government of Norway, that there were concerns that meeting could never deliver on these high expectations. But it did in the end really deliver on many fronts, which was quite a success and quite amazing and quite a surprise, really, by the end of the day. The main, personally, I think the main outcome from Glasgow is the finalization of the Paris Agreement rulebook. If you've had a look at the Paris Agreement, you see it's not many pages. It's fairly thin. It doesn't have a lot of detail. And it was very clear that in order to operationalize it, there needed to be more specific rules. And most of them were adopted in 2018 in Katowice. But there were a couple of issues missing where parties for 3 years were not able to agree. And one, of course, is the regulation of carbon trading between parties under Article 6 of the agreement, which finally was now resolved in Glasgow. Another element were the tables and the tabular formats for reporting under the enhanced transparency framework, very important. It's not very interesting, media didn't pick up on it, but for the functioning of the Paris Agreement, these tables were absolutely crucial. And there's now also agreement on common timeframes, which means of when have parties to, or encouraged to, communicate their next NDC, and how long is an NDC supposed to last. And we know now that's for about 5 years. So these are absolutely important elements for the functioning of the Paris Agreement machinery. But in addition to that, we also have very interesting the Glasgow Climate Pact decisions. That's the first decision under the CMA, the first decision under the COP, one CMA1, one CP26, and I'm sure you've had to look at them, which contain very interesting elements. And I just focus on the one on the Paris Agreement, the cover decision on the Paris Agreement. For the first time, that cover decision actually includes concrete language from the IPCC in that decision, in particular on how to get to net zero by 2050, requiring rapid reductions of emissions by 45% in 2030, and then going to net zero by around 2050. And that's a very interesting development from the Paris Agreement goal in Article 2, which talks about balancing of emissions and removals in the second half of the century. Balancing of emissions and removals is the same like net zero emissions, but the goal is now anticipated in terms of time from second half of the century to mid-century. So that's a raising of ambition in terms of when to get there earlier. The decision also talks about the critical decade which we have entered, that this has to happen now. Most changes have to happen now until 2030 in order to get to where we need to be by 2050. We also see much more or stronger focus on different sectors. I mean, everybody was talking about the phasing down of unabated coal and phasing out of inefficient fossil fuels. That is now well known all over the world due to an extensive media coverage. But there is more to it. There's also a link to biodiversity protection now, which is much stronger role of nature in enhancing climate goals, and the kind of breaking down of silos that we've had in international law, international relations for much too long, where we have biodiversity and nature protection under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and then we have the climate silo. And this is slowly starting to break down because you actually do have to see it in conjunction and integrate these policies in order to make them effective. You also talked about the finance goal, which is, of course, a very important aspect. The Paris Agreement decision, as you perhaps know, the decision from Paris, decision 1 CP21, which adopted the Paris Agreement, contains a number of additional elements that were not written into the agreement itself, including the expectations that developed country parties would provide and mobilize finance of a magnitude of about $100 billion annually to support developing countries. And that goal is supposed to be revised and revisited in 2024, and a new global finance goal is supposed to be adopted with those $100 billion as a floor. So we know there is supposed to be a new goal, and it has to go above and beyond $100 billion every year. And we have not seen those $100 billion yet. In that decision from Glasgow, there is a recognition with regret that developed country parties have not yet been able to provide and mobilize that sum annually. And that has to be seen against that backdrop that currently negotiations are ongoing of raising that goal to something else, and that something else, that new number isn't there yet, and it can be everything from $101 billion to $3 trillion. It's really something that needs to be negotiated, and these are going to be extremely difficult negotiations, which will start in Sharm el-Sheikh. You perhaps also know that parties were requested to submit new updated or enhanced NDCs prior to the meeting in Glasgow. Several parties did, many did not, and there is a new request to all parties to go home after Glasgow, which they did, of course, and to submit an updated or new and enhanced NDC throughout this year prior to the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which is, it's not a legally binding obligation, but it's an expectation. It's a political pressure that has been established, peer pressure, where parties look at each other and see what's happening. And we will have to watch this space and see what's going to happen, what parties put forward prior to the COP in Glasgow. We do know that the current level of ambition in parties' NDCs is not high enough. It is not equivalent to keeping temperature increases or holding them to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. But that's the whole idea of the Paris Agreement, is to create that momentum and that critical peer review dynamic to push up ambition. And the Secretariat is requested to provide an annual synthesis report of where parties collectively are in terms of their overall ambition included in their NDCs. But I think this is going to be something that will happen now every year at the COP. There will be this request for more ambition, and there will be a request to come back the year after with higher ambition. And that's good, because we are not, as I said, we are not where we need to be. And these annual meetings where the whole world gets together and it's in the limelight of media attention and everybody's radar, I think these are very important meetings to push up ambition to where we need to be. I think I might stop here. And as I said earlier, I'm happy to try to address any questions that students might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Voigt. I would like to recommend that we open our windows here for ventilation. Just take a 5-minute break and then come back for 20 minutes of discussion. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. I'm happy to. See you in 5 minutes.
Right. Then we'll see you again at the top of the hour. Dr. Voigt, thank you very, very much for a wealth of information and insights about the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. We are learning about it and want to learn more in the next 20 minutes. And the students are ready to ask questions, and we will ask when they do, with the first question especially, if you are able to hear the question well. All right, who would like to begin? Thank you very much. Mr. Patel from the state of Illinois in the United States.
Yep,
Please speak loud.
sure. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. One question I have is regarding the events of like Glasgow or even Paris or even this upcoming year. So in a few day event, for example, where multiple countries are attending and there's a lot on an agenda or a lot to be discussed, how effective are a lot of those conversations, and what is that atmosphere like when there's so much to discuss and cover in maybe a short amount of time, especially from like a compliance perspective as well?
Thank you. I could hear you, so that's okay. That's a very good question. What's the added value of the whole world traveling to one place once a year? It's for 2 weeks usually. What's happening there? But it is a very there are different levels of things that are happening. One is the formal negotiation. So there are always some issues that need to be discussed, considered, decided. As I just mentioned, what happened in Glasgow, so these were the formal negotiations where negotiators would meet and day and night and negotiate these issues until there is agreement. And as you perhaps know, the decision can only be taken by consensus. There is no voting in the COP, which means that you have to negotiate as long as almost everyone or pretty much everyone is on board. And you can only do this in person. In the COP itself, with 195 member states, that is impossible to agree on anything online. It's difficult enough for the committee, but if you upscale it to the entire COP, you have to meet in person in order to be able to find agreement. So that's the one thing. The formal negotiations are ongoing. Now, as I mentioned, for example, on the global finance goal, that's going to be a formal negotiation, and it's supposed to be finalized next year in the United Emirates. But in addition, the COP are also a very important meeting place. It's a very important meeting place for all sorts of stakeholders. And they really only have that only once a year, where they have this kind of fair kind of setup where you have all sorts of side events and you have big plenary discussions and you have this exchange of ideas, of policies. You have this networking, and that in itself is a real value where you need to get stakeholders together. Many new initiatives come out of that, and you perhaps know in Glasgow, in addition to the formal negotiations, there were a lot of the methane pledge and the forest pledge and transport that is not linked to the formal negotiations, but are in addition very important initiatives to enhance climate action. And then what we've heard, the third level, the third element that what we've seen for the last couple of years are high-level meetings of basically heads of state. That doesn't happen really on the issue of climate change on a global level outside the climate meetings. We had, I think, over 100 heads of state coming to Glasgow and having this issue discussed on the level of the highest political level is showing, the importance of this, and having this venue, having this possibility for heads of state to discuss climate change is a very important element of the COPs as well. And I think I heard some of you talking a little bit. I mean, addressing climate change is addressing basically an issue of global equity or inequity that dates back hundreds of years in terms of who has caused this problem for a long time. That's the developed world that has cut down its forests, has burned coal. And now we can only solve it by, getting everyone together, including developing countries. And that's not easy. That's an issue of equity, of justice, of differentiation between parties' responsibilities. And having that addressed actually does require heads of state to find an agreement. It is so sensitive and so difficult that we actually have to have these in-person meetings at least once a year.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to pick up the camera again and ask who would like to ask the next question. This is Mr. Gillesberger from Austria.
Yes, indeed. So I have a question. In this course, we talk a lot about urgency and acceleration. My question is kind of related to those terms. So when it comes to urgency, I'm quite really appreciate all the work that you do, and I imagine the whole process, these procedural rules, inherently difficult. But kind of when we think of the urgency, it kind of seems to be a little bit of, okay, the committee was established in 2015, and now we have 2022, and the rules are hopefully then finally ready, so the committee can go back to work. And kind of my question is, since you also kind of are within those negotiations of multiple decades, I think you said 20 years, is there kind of, are things changing and are things getting quicker, and since also kind of media attention and political willingness maybe is more, so do you have the impression that on the current framework we can kind of change quick enough, since we're also thinking about 2030, but we have to reduce emissions by quite a lot, so yeah.
Excellent question, and very pertinent one, which I like a lot, because this was the 26th COP, which means we have a COP per year. This is 26 years plus the 2020, which didn't have, so 28 years. And what has changed? Greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are still increasing. What's the dent, if there is any, that this regime has made? And I think this is a really crucial question, and it should be put at the forefront to everything that's happening there. What I can see currently is with that, with this annual request to parties to come forward, or at least for this year, to come forward with new NDCs, updated nationally determined contributions, that adds more pressure. We've never had that before. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there were 5-year terms, and under the Paris Agreement, we may also have 5 years at some point. But currently, adding pressure, saying no, after Glasgow, you all go home and you come back this year, 2022, with updated and new NDCs. Even though you may have done it last year already, you still go home and check the last stones on whether you find more ambitious climate action. And everybody is going to come back this year with a new enhanced NDC. This is unprecedented, and that shows to me that suddenly there is this kind of urgency injected into the process. But it is a formal process. Of course, it's under the United Nations and never moves very fast. But we also need to move together because of this global equity challenge. But I think I see some changes. Also, the much stronger recognition of the 1.5 degree target as compared to -2 degree. That this is now the target parties actually are working against, it includes more urgency and more ambition into the work. But we still have to see the real world changes on the ground, and I think there your question needs to be heard many more times by other circles.
We are thinking constantly about urgency and acceleration on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh. One of our students, Turkish student, also has a question about the biannual enhanced transparency reporting, and perhaps that also can be a tool used to encourage more verifiable and quicker compliance. Could you ask that question?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you for taking your time and presenting for us here. My question is about this report. I believe, like in all reports, there is also some room in this report for manipulation. How do you control that information provided in the report is not manipulated, or how do you control? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you.
And how can you control that there is not wrong or missing information in the report, especially considering the fact that we get so many reports from so many countries every year? What are the control mechanisms here?
Yeah. Yeah, when I leaned forward, it was just closer to my my computer's speakers. That very good question. And what do you usually do when you want to make sure that the information is correct? You trust to a certain extent, but you verify. And this is also how the enhanced transparency framework is built under the PAICC agreement. So there is, of course, the requirement that parties put forward this information. There's a certain amount of trust that they will do that, but there is a technical expert review. And these are panels, and every single report by every party, every other year is supposed to go through that technical expert review. So that's a lot of logistics and administration that is just building up, and we haven't seen it. The first report is due in 2024. So these technical expert review teams, and for each country, there will be a small team to check whether that information is actually correct, as opposed to be able to engage with the country or with the state concerned and ask questions. But they also have the possibility to have in-country visits, so they can go there and check. That doesn't have to happen with all countries all the time, but the possibility is there. So if these review teams think, oh, this sounds a little bit niffy, there is something that we think should better be checked, they have the possibility to go and have in-country visits, or invite the country to Bonn or to a meeting to discuss this. Of course, there is still a certain degree of uncertainty, but that is always the case. But what I wanted to highlight is that there is the possibility there is, first of all, an obligatory technical expert review, and there is a possibility for the review teams to actually do check on the accuracy of the information provided.
Thank you very much.
A related question, does that mean that the rules of procedure that are being finalized by PAICC also include the possibility that these technical verifications could be reported back to the committee, and that the committee then would have the mandate to take action? And if so, what would the action be?
Yes, indeed. The committee has a link to these technical expert review teams. And if the review teams identify significant and persistent inconsistencies, so party is just not providing the relevant data, or it's providing incorrect data, inconsistent data, then the committee can become active. The big compromise that was done and was necessary in order to get the committee to link with the technical expert review reports was this: that can only be done with the consent of the party concerned. And here you can, of course, say, what's the point? If the party doesn't provide the relevant information, it probably won't be interested in engaging with the committee, and the committee needs the consent of the party. So what, is this ever going to take off? We don't know, but this is how this is structured, and this is only possible if the party is willing to engage. But if it's a capacity challenge, so it's not just political willingness, but they just don't have the means to do that reporting correctly, and they just need support of one way or the other, then this is actually something that may be helpful for the party concerned in addressing that shortage.
I think we will have time for at least one more question. I see another colleague from Turkey is ready to ask a question.
I wanted to ask about the level of education. So there are all these goals, and nations also themselves have their NDCs and have their inter-country dynamics, have their legislation, etc. But to really make a societal change, it also needs to be implemented from to all levels of education. So I wanted to ask, how much of a reach does this committee have into the inner education affairs of countries? For example, to include carbon capture in primary school curriculums, or to include other things in university curriculums, or to kind of streamline processes a little bit. Like, how or does it at all go deep into this lack of education and awareness from younger ages?
Excellent question. Actually, there is a provision in the agreement, I think it's Article 12, that deals with awareness raising and communication and education. But your question is a bit more deeper, and it's an interesting one because the agreement itself is an agreement between sovereign states. You know, they have negotiated in Paris and agreed to it, and they're bound by it. But the Paris Agreement is actually something that has much more societal impact than just, you know, an international agreement between states. Because, as you rightly said, in defining the national determined contribution, every 5 years, and every 5 years it has to progress in its level of ambition. There is a foreseeable national process that has to happen where, you know, that you have to be hearings, there have to be drafts that are disseminated to the public. And it is something that is meant to lead to changes in the systemic structure, both in education, media coverage, how things are taught at university, and it may lead to curriculum changes, including more climate law and politics and so forth. And we see just the beginnings of that. But the whole idea of having nationally determined contributions, it means it comes from a bottom-up process where states have to engage with all relevant stakeholders in order to define their national climate policies. And that is also supposed to lead then to more education and communication on climate issues.
When the COP26 was postponed for 1 year, in the fall of that year, there were online meetings that everyone could attend. And I started attending them. It's where I first became aware of your work. And I remember listening to someone in that context talking about how it may have been in the neighboring country of Sweden that the NDC was negotiated at the national level. And the speaker said that all stakeholders were involved in thinking about and deciding what the nationally determined contribution would be. And it seems to me that a well-educated population that is given the mandate to participate in that process really allows us citizens to help PAICC in implementing and in guaranteeing compliance, as though we citizens are somehow assistants to the committee.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I also, as we get to our final 10 minutes, want to say that in essence, what Dr. Voigt has done today is also a part of that puzzle. She has come to us as the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Climate Compliance Committee. She has been educating us. And I think it is up to us now to take what she has given us and to use it also to participate as stakeholders in all of the countries we represent to contribute to the accelerating of climate change mitigation in the UN and Paris Agreement framework. And if we do, then it seems to me that this will have been a very valuable time in March of 2022 as we start thinking about what will happen in Egypt at the end of this year. Dr. Voigt, I would like to ask you for some final comments. Also, if you are willing to envision what work is going to take place now over the next 6, 7, 8 months so that Sharm el-Sheikh will be a success.
Well, there is a lot of work going on right now. One that we already talked about, it's the communication of updated and enhanced NDCs, which is a very important aspect. And as you rightly said, it is something where, you know, in enlightened democracies, many stakeholders are involved, but it's also something that is spreading to those countries where maybe they historically don't have that kind of participatory regulatory framework. but it is a process that every party, and we have 195 parties, has to do. And there is a spread of best practices and expectations of how to design an NDC. And I think this is also enhancing participation by stakeholders in places of the world where that necessarily wasn't the case. So I think that's important. And it's an encouragement to everyone to be on top of that game, to understand these processes, to see the possibilities that this agreement provides to participate in these discourses, debates, and policy making, because it is an agreement for everyone. And I think the better you know it, the more you can use it, and you can really use it as a very good tool and shield and sword, or whatever you want to use it for, in order to enhance climate action, because it gives an authoritative argument in whatever you say. If you can link it back to the Paris Agreement, it does give you a certain degree of legitimacy as agreed, multilaterally. So I just encourage you to read it, to use it, to follow the discussions, but also engage, most importantly, in your countries. And there's so many different countries respected in the room. And I think you can do a lot of change with what you've heard, and being active citizens, enlightened citizens in your respective home constituencies.
1 week from now, we will be receiving more information from a member of the EU Commission who is working on possibilities for accelerating on the road to Fit for 55 in the EU, in the sector of transportation. And then we will be meeting with a professor from the University of Michigan who's going to talk to us about the global methane pledge, also one of the deliverables from COP26. And we will be very eager to see if that is being implemented now, and what can be done to make sure that it is implemented successfully and swiftly. Dr. Voigt, I want to thank you very, very much again for spending your afternoon with us today. And we all wish you the very best for your work. We will be looking to see you in Egypt in November, and we are on your side.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. And thanks to the students for listening. Thanks for your attention, but also thank you for your questions. They were excellent, and there are no wrong questions. It's such a complicated, complex field. So I really appreciated them. And they also showed me quite a significant amount of knowledge that you have here in your room. Thank you, and all the best. Stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.